Yeah, good morning. Do you hear me well with the microphone? Okay.
Without microphone?
With this one? I guess so. Okay, as you rightly said in the beginning, we are moving slowly towards the humanity as an actor in the whole Earth system, basically. And for describing this and for putting limits of human interference with the planet Earth, the framework of planetary boundaries has been developed quite recently. I'm going to introduce that to you and talk also a little bit about how to quantify these dimensions and what the modeling could do. I will not show any equations, but still you would see that there's a lot of mathematics going on behind that. So let me start with this very basic observation that one of the two current directors of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, where I'm mainly working, has formulated a while ago a tweet, as you can see, and he wrote it took 50 years to push the planet out of 10,000 years of stability, and the coming 50 years might determine the future 10,000 years of planet Earth. So obviously humans have kind of dramatically changed the status of planet Earth, pushing it some way out of the quasi-stable state that we had in the past like 10 to 12,000 years, which was the Holocene state of planet Earth. And what we do as a collective humanity in the next decades or so, that might really determine what the next 10,000 years or more will be about, because we might trigger very long-term developments that cannot just be stopped once they have started. So I mentioned the Holocene Epoch. Most or some of you might know it. This is a typical scheme of how the Earth ages are usually portrayed. So you see this snail starting like 4.5 billion years ago when Earth was formed and ending through the ages in today's epoch, which is the Holocene, so the last 11,700 years. And why is that important? Because it is the period where Earth warmed after the last big ice age, and it showed some relatively stable climate. So there were fluctuations, of course, but no major disruptions or major changes, which in the end allowed the human civilization of now 7.7 billion people to develop, to prosper, to live on this planet Earth. So it provided a habitat for billions of people. Agriculture emerged after the Ice Age. Whole civilization history of Earth, of humans, was in this period, of course. But later on, we see the phenomena of industrialization, urbanization, and significant resource use, which had these strong impacts very recently on the Earth system.
What is this very precise date that you are using, 11,700 years? That's presumably when the younger dryas ended? Okay.
Martin can confirm that. Yeah, exactly.
You know, these things have moved around a little bit. But last glacial maximum and
it's the end.
Very precise, and I don't know how accurate.
Geologists need a precise date, but
okay, you know, when I worked on the younger dryas, it was 9,000 to 10,000 years ago.
Yeah.
Okay, that's an interesting point. But now we look at the past like 270 years, and you might really know these exponential curves which characterize the Anthropocene. So that is the state of the Holocene as it is termed now. Anthropocene with humans as a main actor and shaper of the Earth system, basically. And what is shown here is like the surface temperature of the Earth, ocean acidification. In the middle row, like building of large dams, freshwater use, and the below row, tropical forest loss, domesticated land, terrestrial biosphere degradation. So there are many plots like this, which all show like an exponential rise from the 1950s, 60s onward. And that many, these figures show the manifestation of the strong human impact on planet Earth in many, many dimensions. So the question arising out of this Anthropocene discussion is where maybe to put a cap on these developments, where to stop them. Can they go on forever, Or is there really limits to all these interferences which we should not cross, because that might really lead to dangerous pathways of the whole planet Earth, basically. And you know this discussion from climate change, the 1.5 and 2 degree goal discussion, which is a clear cap to the global warming, so the surface temperature development. But there, as you see here, there are many other dimensions of how humans interfere with the Earth system. And the question arose like 10 years ago, or of course even earlier, but the planetary boundaries concept was developed like 10 years ago. Can we find numbers similar to the 2 degree target for climate change for other processes as well, and combine them into one single framework? And that was the idea of the planetary boundaries framework, first published in 2009 with the lead author Johan Rockström again, and they plotted this iconic figure of 9 Earth system dimensions, processes, of which some are already red, flagged in red. That means tolerable thresholds, limits are already crossed along these dimensions. I come back to this in a minute. The concept was updated in 2015 by Will Steffen and a number of other authors, coming up with a new figure. I will destroy everything here. Oh, vielleicht siehst du es besser. Okay, geht's so? Yeah, okay. I'm shaking up everything, but I'm not shaking up planet Earth. Okay, so a new figure with different illustration and showing that 4, not only 3 dimensions are transgressed according to their calculations. So that's still basic papers for the planetary boundaries framework. There have been like 80 papers or so working on individual aspects of it. So this is this is a scientific agenda which is flourishing still, and it also gets fruitful more and more in policy and even business domains. Because people want to relate to, like business companies, for example, the footprint that we generate with our resource use has anything to do with these global Earth system impacts, and what is our contribution to that. Okay, I'm just summarizing what this concept or framework is actually about. So it defines for 9 interacting Earth system processes planetary boundaries. I abbreviate them here from now on as PBs. And they all together delineate the Holocene state of the Earth system. So the Holocene is here the reference point, basically. And those dimensions are climate change, of course, stratospheric ozone depletion, atmospheric aerosol loading, so like air pollution, basically, ocean acidification, biogeochemical flows and their disturbance by humans, so like nitrogen and phosphorus inputs into water ecosystems. Novel entities is a general term for any chemicals, new materials, plastics, and so on that people bring into the environment. So that's a very complex thing, very hard to quantify, of course. And land system change, so mainly deforestation. Biosphere integrity is a term that tries to integrate all the major functions of the biosphere of Earth, so mainly biodiversity, but also some other aspects, and the freshwater use. So that's the 9 dimensions that the authors thought these all together define kind of the Holocene state of the Earth system. We should try to find limits for human interference with them. And the Holocene is, of course, as I mentioned before, considered because that's the only period we know where human civilization flourished. So we do not or cannot be sure of any other state of the Earth system, especially in terms of climate and biosphere, would still allow us a habitable planet, basically. And they say, that's another term, the Holocene is a safe operating space for humanity. So if this is kind of maintained, humanity can still prosper. Safe space or safe operating space. And the idea is that if one or more of the planetary boundaries are really transgressed, then the Earth system might change towards a dangerous path with negative consequences for the status of planet Earth and for humanity as well. So this is kind of a precautionary principle. Boundaries are defined to avoid some negative developments, which are, however, uncertain, so we would not know if they really happen. So that's about risk, a risk approach, basically. And it's often portrayed like this. So we have in green the safe space, then a scientific zone of uncertainty in yellow, and a dangerous space in red. And the boundary you see, this is the blue line, it is put at the end, at the lower end of the uncertainty zone and the upper end of the safe space. So it is assumed that if the development of a control variable, which could be CO2 concentration of the atmosphere or freshwater use, that should not cross this blue line, the planetary boundary, because we then enter a domain where uncertainty about the development globally gets too high. There might even be some thresholds like tipping points. We heard about some yesterday that might happen at a large scale, and we really want to avoid that. So better stay within the green safe operating space. So to summarize that, the boundary is put for 9 dimensions to minimize the risk of dangerous, disastrous developments, and the position of possible critical thresholds, it's unknown, so we do not have good scientific knowledge about it. So be in a safe distance from such possible developments. There might also positive feedbacks occurring in the yellow and red zone. Processes with long time lags can happen, like the slow melting of Greenland and Arctic ice and warming of the oceans, permafrost melting, which with very long-term releases of carbon and methane, which can happen over centuries once it has started, and societies might not really be prepared for such developments. So that's all reasons why we should precautionarily set planetary boundaries for like these 9 processes. Okay, I said the control variable, an example could be atmospheric CO2 content, and a response variable which is plotted on the y-axis. That is then the surface air temperature, but any impact that the increase in the temperature and the changes in precipitation might provoke. So this is a very good knowledge, of course, from the climate change community, that we know that beyond 2 degrees, some processes might really intensify or happen that would not happen if the warming was lesser. And there's one figure by Tim Lenton and colleagues who showed that, for example. So you see on the y-axis the temperature anomaly, so the warming, surface warming of planet Earth, and then in gray, this Paris range, so like keeping the Paris Agreement in December 2016, where nations agreed that global warming should be well below 2 degrees. So that's there, and they plotted here like the major tipping points in planet Earth that might happen and where they are, according to current scientific knowledge, assumed to be happen. So we see that already with a warming of 2 degrees on average, the risk increases somehow that Greenland ice is starting to melt, and also Arctic summer ice and the glaciers, we know already they are melting very strongly. Coral reefs, we are afraid that they start to disappear if Earth warming is already only 1.5 degrees. So there are systems on Earth that really degrade with a warming of 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius global average mean temperature. So we are not really safe at this level, but processes might still be kind of controllable compared to a situation of warmings like more than 4 degrees. Then you see the very big tipping points getting more likely, like the decline of the Amazon rainforest and other phenomena. So this is a tipping point literature. Maybe Tim Lenton will show up the next days. He will talk about this probably quite intensively. So according to the latest assessment, 4 of the 9 planetary boundaries are already transgressed because the limits that scientists thought should be kept, we are beyond those already. And so this is true for the climate change. We are in this yellow uncertainty zone already with a mean global warming of more than 1 degree already. Biosphere integrity, that means biodiversity loss, strongly crossed because we have eradicated or put at threat many, many species, especially due to land cover change. And this is thought to be not tolerable from an Earth system point of view. Biogeochemical flows is also kind of transgressed because in many regions, nitrogen and phosphorus flows to the lakes, rivers, and oceans are beyond any natural fluctuation, basically. And there's a boundary for land system change, so the removal of original forest is also thought to be more than we should really do. So look into the numbers behind that. So this climate change boundary is defined as an atmospheric CO2 concentration of only 350 ppm. I think that would be kind of a global warming of 1 degree or less. So it's really precautionary, very low, but we are far beyond it already, above 400 ppm, and that is why we are in this yellow zone, including the uncertainty range that is put here up to 450 ppm. And this biosphere integrity, so it's basically a measure for extinction rate of species, is far transgressed, so at least more than 10 times the natural extinction rate we have now, and that is deemed to be not acceptable. And boundary for land system change, which says that globally 75% of the original forest should be there because it has major functions for the Earth, for the climate system, for biodiversity also. So you see how it all also interrelates. And yeah, we heard already yesterday the moisture recycling in forests like the Amazon. This is a major function that needs to be maintained, because if it kind of collapses, it might have strong effects in regions elsewhere also. And these are measures for phosphorus and nitrogen flows into freshwater bodies and the ocean. That's a rough first calculation for some of them, because there's still much work to do to define such boundaries precisely, and also to look at the spatial patterns that they have. So only global numbers might be much too simple, because many of the processes like phosphorus, nitrogen happen only in some regions, so we should look into the regions as well. And basically this land system change boundary, so the remaining fraction of the original forest, this is kind of the test. I'm always confusing this. Oh, sorry for that. Because das ist der Schuldige.
Okay.
So what they actually do is defining a boundary for each continent and forest biome. So there's a boundary for the temperate forest, for the boreal forests, and for the tropical forests. And they put here like individual ranges. So like for boreal forest and tropical forest, 85% should remain, while they allow 50% deforestation for temperate forests. So that's really rough estimates to start with, accounting somehow for the relative importance of these major biomes for the Earth system as a whole. So the idea here is we kind of should be able to not deforest these systems too much, because that will have strong impacts on at least the climate system and the biodiversity there. Okay, as I said, that's the scientific work is really ongoing, and I think it will go on for like 10 more years or so, how to determine the numbers and the patterns behind that for the boundaries to set them correctly. So first there are the top-down approaches, really working with global numbers only, and bottom-up approaches which try to look, are there local boundaries for all these processes in different locations in the world, and can we somehow aggregate them to a global value? The latter one is the approach that is now being followed basically because the regions actually matter. Some are maybe more important than others, need to get more weight, and if you want to relate policies to that, I think you need to know what a specific country's contribution maybe is to global boundary. That's easy for the CO2 emissions. You can determine the emissions per country, but what about water use or biodiversity degradation and so on? So that's not so easy to account with only a global number. So finding the right spatial scale is still an issue here in this scientific discussion. And for climate change we know, but for the other 8 boundaries we are not so sure what happens when there is a transgression. So will that really change the Earth system so much that we should put a precautionary boundary at this or that point? So what is needed here is like a risk assessment, a systematic and model-based risk assessment. What happens if boundaries transgressed? And we are actually trying to explore that now, moving the Earth system in experimental model simulations closer to the boundary as they are currently defined and beyond the boundary to see what is really happening there, and if the current boundaries are set properly, or if they should be higher or lower, or if they should be defined differently. So maybe these definitions that are currently there are not the best ones that we could have for water use, for land system change, and so on. And yeah, there are manifold interactions between the boundaries which need to be accounted for, because what I said in the beginning, these 9 boundaries are describing the Earth system as a whole. You cannot look at them isolated, but all together. If climate change would go on, it could strongly affect the status of other boundaries. If you have land system change, it can feed back to the climate again. And so you see there are many interactions which are basically about the major feedbacks in the Earth system. So it's not only about preserving the climate, but the feedbacks of the climate with the biosphere and feedbacks within the biosphere that should all not move into a domain that has not been seen in the Holocene, basically, because it could be dangerous. And you can imagine there are a number of data uncertainties regarding all this, and even if you use different data sets on what was the original forest cover in the Holocene, that's not an easy answer to that. You can use proxy data or model simulations, but they will deliver different results, and even the current extent of agriculture and land is not so well known. We might hear that in the next talk maybe. So if you use different data products, you can come up with different statuses of the boundary, perhaps. So systematic uncertainty assessments are also what is still needed here. And then the question is, why should we stay within the safe space along the 9 dimensions? It is to preserve sustainable pathways for humanity. But what are these pathways? So here we need kind of integrated modeling of the Earth system, including the societal dynamics, the socioeconomics, demographics, resource use, management, and so on. So is it possible with up to 10 billion people even in the future to stay within the safe space, or even to get back to it? Because you have seen we are beyond it already in 4 out of 9 dimensions. So that's the big question. Can we go back into the safe space while still allowing, while still having the population growth, and maybe increased resource demand? And the planetary boundary operationalization is what I said before, that policies are more and more interested in that. For example, we are currently doing a study for North Rhine-Westphalia, a part of Germany, because they wanted to know how our environmental goals that we set for the country, how can they be related to the global boundary values? And you can imagine that's not so easy, but there are calculation schemes being developed how to make these interrelations. And it has also been done for some European countries and others, and it was found that especially European countries, they are beyond the boundaries very strongly with their footprint that they generate on planet Earth. So it's close to the ecological footprint discussion, of course, that where we know this basically from already. But now it is possible to make even the relationship with the global planetary boundaries somehow. And I think some process-based Earth system modeling can really help to answer some of these questions, because the models, and also integrated assessment models, they are suited for exactly this, if they are able to somehow incorporate the planetary boundary definitions in their modeling schemes. That's what we started, not with a completely coupled Earth system model, but with a biosphere model, which is called LPJML, Lund, Potsdam, Jena Managed Land Model. So it's a model of the terrestrial land surface. Usually we are operating with a grid, raster-based modeling approach, like 60,000 grid cells over land globally at a specific resolution. And in each of these grid cells, we simulate the natural vegetation and its dynamics over time, driven by climate, for example. And there are also like agricultural types in there, and also bioenergy plant types and so on. So there's a mixture of vegetation in each of these grid cells, which reflects also how like humans have managed and changed the land surface already, including irrigation also of crops, including the hydrological cycle and the carbon cycle. So what we have is the coupling of vegetation dynamics with water cycle and carbon cycle basically, and now also nitrogen cycle. It's not coupled, unless with the exception of a few experiments with the climate model, so that would fully couple the biosphere with the climate. That's being worked on for our next step, and there were some simple couplings before, but the full couple in like an Earth system model is still ongoing. But still, you can see we might be able here to cover planetary boundaries for nitrogen flows, for freshwater use, for land system change, and maybe also for biosphere integrity and biodiversity. So like 4 or 5 out of the 9 dimensions, such a model can cover because it simulates all these processes like here, ecological, biogeochemical, hydrological in a single and consistent framework. So as I said, water dynamics, carbon dynamics, vegetation dynamics, all coupled in such a model. You see a simple flow chart in the back, which combines the major processes, and you can have a close look. So this is just the irrigation module. Of course, you do not need to read that. I'm just showing it because even this tiny module within the big model already has a number of functions and equations and so on. So it's kind of a really sophisticated model by now, bringing together the major processes in a simulation framework. And yeah, I just want to show one example that we explored with that model, which is the planetary boundary for global freshwater use. You might remember in the plot it was shown that this is still in the safe operating space, which would suggest that humans still can take out a lot of water out of the system because the Earth system is not, there's no dangerous interference with the Earth system yet. But this has been strongly criticized because we know that in many places of the world, much more water is being taken out of the system that is tolerable from a local point of view. So there are rivers like the Colorado running dry because much water is stored upstream and taken out from the river. Along the river network, there's groundwater overuse in many regions and things like this. So people know it's very problematic in many regions, but according to their first calculation, the global status might still be okay. And that's why we thought we look deeper into how this first calculation has been done and how it can be improved with our modeling approach, basically. So what they did in a 2009 paper for the freshwater boundary is starting with the global discharge from rivers to the oceans, which is like 40,000 cubic kilometers per year. And then inaccessible flow was extracted from that. That is river flows in Siberian rivers, in tropical rivers, so on. Because the idea behind that is these are mostly natural flows still, kind of, and we should not modify them too much anymore, so to keep these systems at least intact. But you see large amounts of water have been just ignored then because these flows have been taken out, which leaves us with like 12,500 cubic kilometers per year of maximum water use by humans from the rivers and reservoirs. That is already a simple radical step. So these regions taken out, as I said, and then from this remainder, so-called environmental flows were extracted mainly, which is the amount of water that should flow into rivers, in the rivers to keep the river ecosystems intact. But humans, of course, have started taking out much water from the river systems, and by that, they interfere with the ecosystems and degrade them to a fair or bad status, basically. And there was a simple calculation that everywhere around the world, like, I think like 30% or so of the flows should be preserved to keep the river ecosystems intact. So a simple global number, but at least is accounted for like the ecological functions of the rivers somehow. Then there was a simple uncertainty range applied, and the final conclusion here was, let's say 4,000 cubic kilometers per year human water consumption, that is the maximum tolerable, but only using these top-down global numbers in a very simplified way, which has been criticized, as I said. So we started with only improving this estimate of the environmental flow requirements, which was a global average, and we used our model to calculate for each river stretch around the world what would be the environmental flows of the discharge going through the rivers there that would preserve the ecosystems. So there are simple approaches to do that globally, and you will see that in some rivers more water needs to stay in the river, and in other regions less water needs to stay there because the freshwater biomes are adapted differently to the river flow regimes in different regions. We used 5 methods to cover some uncertainty in these environmental flow estimates. Yeah, and this is a plot just showing to estimate the environmental flow requirements of rivers. So what is the amount and status of the water system that should be there to preserve the ecosystems in a good status? There are many approaches to do that, like habitat simulations, hydrological approaches, which is the one we are using, which only accounts for the river flow and not for biological or geochemical factors like other approaches do. So it's a simple approach still, just looking at how much water should flow through the river system to preserve it in a good status. Behind that is an accounting table. No need, I think, to explain that. And what we find that in the end maps like this, maybe the top map, which is the average of the 5 methods. So in the green regions, the fraction of the total discharge that should be preserved is low, and in other regions it is high. So you see a spatial pattern of how much, what the share of the river flow is in specific regions that should be preserved to not disturb the ecosystems too much. And we used that and calculated a new planetary boundary using all the indicators from the former calculations, but just putting in a new estimate for the environmental flow part. And we found basically that even if you start doing a spatial pattern of one of the aspects considered in the freshwater boundary, you can come to different results. Like we find that this boundary could be somewhere between 1,100 and 4,500 cubic kilometers, and it must not be necessarily the 4,000 cubic kilometers. So this is just one example showing that the scientific discussion is really going on where to put these boundaries. And as soon as you start looking more into the details, even the definitions and the positions of the boundaries could be changed. And important why we did that basically is to demonstrate in what regions local tolerance limits. So in this case, the environmental flows of rivers where they have been transgressed by human water withdrawals. And you see here the well-known pattern that in many regions, Near East, India, Middle East, Southern Europe, Western USA, humans take too much water out of the system already, thereby disturbing the freshwater ecosystems. The question is still how to aggregate this to a global number if you have such a spatial pattern. And we tried that in the paper and then came to the conclusion that this boundary might be lower than thought originally if you really account for the spatial patterns and give weight to local transgressions, basically. I won't explain that in detail, but this is a work in progress, basically, paper just submitted showing that the functions of water in the Earth system are, of course, not only preserving the river flows and the ecosystems in the rivers. They are much more, like Yeah, we heard yesterday in talks the moisture recycling in the Amazon is really important to be intact. This is also about water and the water cycle needed to preserve there. And the question is, what about the frozen, the lake glacier water and the groundwater, the soil moisture, which needs to be sufficient? Another talk yesterday we heard of, if it's very important, the soil moisture status to control the productivity and locations of vegetation. So there might also be like a sub-boundary somehow for the soil moisture that covers especially for the water vegetation interactions. This is just a conceptual paper trying to bring together the roles of the water cycle in the Earth system, which we actually need to understand and then think about maybe a multi-dimensional freshwater boundary that really accounts for these processes and tells us where and to what degree can the water cycle be disturbed by humans to really avoid that we shift into another status. Really complicated discussion already only from the water perspective, but it also kind of relates to the climate change, to the land system change and so on, which makes us clearer and clearer every day that everything is so interconnected, and that's why we need these 9 boundaries as a whole. So that's a complex depiction of the water role, freshwater cycle role in the Earth system somehow. And yeah, then I said before, if one boundary is transgressed, like for climate change, there will be strong impacts. For example, we showed it in a paper for, yeah, this map actually shows the regions in red where there's a high likelihood if global warming would reach 2 degrees that droughts would occur more frequently and long-term average water availability would decline. So in regions like Eastern Europe, yeah, and in all the regions that are colored red here, there is already at a 2-degree warming globally a high risk that less water resources would be available there because it rains less and it's getting hotter, which increases the evapotranspiration. In a world of 3 or 3.5 degree warming, which is actually a trajectory we are on right now because the pledges that countries made in the Paris Agreement are not sufficient to keep 2-degree warming. It may rather lead us to 3 degrees or even more. That would be this situation that in many more regions with an even higher risk, water resources would decline. So really something to avoid. That's why the precautionary limit is set at 2 degrees to have a world maybe looking like this, but not a world looking like this, because that means really strong water stress in many regions. A 5-degree world, of course, would be even worse. So definitely to be avoided this red zone of that boundary. And I said before, if that would be transgressed, like climate change, less water available, it could, of course, feed back to the environmental flows in the end in the river systems. So it would create impacts on the freshwater boundary as well. And in these interactions, there's actually no study yet that has really demonstrated then in this planetary boundaries framework. And that's the next generation, I think, of simulations regarding this research topic. About all these interactions that you can plot for the different dimensions. Basically here, climate change having effects on other boundaries and vice versa. And yeah, now to the societal question behind that in the last slides I brought. I'm starting with, what was the historical development of the status of the boundaries? So that would be this pre-industrial situation, like 1750 or so. None of the 9 boundaries is transgressed, so everything is green here, no yellow and red zones. If we move to like 1950, before the high Anthropocenic curves started to develop exponentially, but we still saw here a strong loss in biodiversity already because of many land use changes, deforestations going on. So at that stage, at least this biosphere integrity boundary or biodiversity loss was affected very strongly already. That's a situation of the 1990s, basically. What you see first here, that phosphorus and nitrogen flows somehow occur here already, but also the stratospheric ozone depletion. That, of course, was the big discussion in the 90s, the big ozone hole over the Antarctic. That was alarmingly red in that period. But if you move to today, you see it disappears because this problem was known what was the reason for it. Problem was solved, and so the ozone hole became smaller and smaller. So it's not in a yellow red zone at the moment, luckily. So you can put the Earth system, at least for some dimensions, back into the green space, basically, if you know what to do, and if you actually do that. But other dimensions like phosphorus, nitrogen flows, and land system change, climate change becomes stronger here. So we are moving out of the green space in several dimensions gradually now. So that might be further alarming then, because it's so multidimensional, this problem now. And I'm coming back to this figure. I mean, there are options for the ozone depletion. That was just one example, but maybe there are options for other boundaries as well to stay below them. That's why I would say that this green space is also an opportunity space for human world population. We could talk here about technological innovations, improved resource use efficiency, improved resource distribution, producing products in regions that would less affect the Earth system if you modify these regions or the resources there and the land use there compared to other regions, so improved spatial distribution. But we need to keep in mind the equity and justice aspects that are playing here as well. But the idea basically is to find pathways for humanity in the next 100 years or so, at least to stay within this green safe space or to even go back to it for the dimensions that we have stressed already. But as I said, preserving also the social goals. So there are more complicated figures appearing now, planetary boundaries on the outside, and within it there's a circle of the social foundations of humanity. These are like reducing hunger, providing clean water for all, providing education, and all these social goals being thought and brought together. That, of course, relates to sustainable development goals of the United Nations. They ideally would be reached within, while maintaining the 9 planetary boundaries. So bring these super goals together somehow. I'm in the last couple of slides, which is about one simulation we did. I will focus on the food aspect here. So like 800 million people are undernourished presently, and we might see a population rise of another 2 billion people or even more in the future. So the question is, can the food for these people be produced while staying within the, at least the land-based planetary boundaries? That's a question we were asking to our model. So it basically means that's the current world with these boundaries globally transgressed, and freshwater boundary in some locations. And the best world would be that we go back to green, safe operating space for all of them, while at the same time producing enough food for all. Behind that would obviously be avoid further cropland expansion, because the land system boundary is already transgressed, halt the biodiversity loss, because that is very strongly transgressed too, reduce the nitrogen and phosphorus loads, keep the global warming really below 2 degrees, and also limit the freshwater use in those regions where we are taking out water of the system too much already. So that's the big challenge behind that. And I'm just showing one example that there are solutions to fulfill at least some aspects of this. These are methods in agriculture that you can do to use the freshwater, land, and nutrient resources more effectively. And the left ones are water management options on the ground. So what you can do is reducing the soil evaporation by just covering the bare soil, which keeps the water in the soil and makes it more easier or more likely for plants to take up the water that is there, using it for transpiration and building up the biomass. So it would only shift the transpiration from the evaporation directly from the soil through the plants, and that would be beneficial then for the crop production and the yields, basically. Another method is water harvesting in ponds, cisterns, whatever, collect the water in the wet season and use it in the dry season for irrigation, ideally drip irrigation, which brings the water directly to the plants, because that means there's little water lost on the way to the plants. So that combination would be very effective in many places, and field studies show that a doubling or even a quadrupling of yields is possible if you do that without using any more water or land. So it's just using water that is there in other ways and more effectively. Right, coming to an end soon. So we did a global scenario study of that, assuming that these methods are being applied on all cropland globally, and we found that the kilocalorie production can be increased by up to 40% if it was really possible to do that everywhere on existing cropland. Very ambitious, of course, but it shows the potential. And you could even save water through that, because irrigation is much more efficient in this simulation. So that is part of a bigger study we were just completing, which is about this big question of feeding 10 billion people maybe while staying within multiple planetary boundaries. So what we did is setting back the Earth system to a state where 4 planetary boundaries are respected, like environmental flows are not transgressed, so irrigation is not allowed there. So we would calculate how many crop yields you would lose by doing that. And you would abandon cropland in regions where the land system change boundary is transgressed and so on. And in the next step, we look, are there sustainable practices within this safe space where you see big losses of crop production then in this theoretical situation, but there are options to lift the crop productions by sustainable methods from this status. And that's a big simulation we did. We found that if you limit freshwater use and irrigation in regions where environmental flows are transgressed, you lose 4% of global crop production. It's relatively low because irrigation is produces only a third of global food. Another 2/3 is produced without irrigation. Well, and if you limit nitrogen application in regions where there's too strong nitrogen application already, if you abandon some cropland because land system change boundary is transgressed, and if you stop further crop conversion for reasons of protecting biodiversity and biodiversity-rich reasons, you would lose like 50% of the crop production, and it means that half of current agriculture yields are being produced by transgressing planetary boundaries, basically. But then we had a set of simulations like assuming that cropland expansion is still feasible within the land system change boundary, but in other regions that might be less important from the Earth system point of view, where still some deforestations might be possible. Irrigation expansion is also part of this. Improved water and also nitrogen management on crop fields, like the examples that I showed there, could lift global crop production by 35%, basically. And food loss reduction and diet changes toward less meat consumption is a big share here also. So this is what we combined in the model to calculate first the theoretical losses if you just strictly keep the boundaries, and then have sustainable practices to get more yields out of the system still. So we would find that 50% net gain of crop kilocalorie production would be possible, basically, when all this will be brought together. That would be just enough for feeding 10 billion people globally, neglecting trade, however, in this case. But it means these massive transformations that I said, radical transformation, basically, of the agricultural sector. Very strong implications, but whether that's possible in the real world, that probably other models and communities will have to explore. But that puts, from the Earth system point of view, the challenge, and it shows there's still the opportunity to feed 10 billion while staying within the boundaries. Okay, I'm cutting this short because I basically said that, and I'm just coming to the end here with some 4 major conclusions. So the planetary boundary framework kind of entails a system thinking about planet Earth as a whole and the role of humans in it. The development of the planetary boundaries and their definition, the regionalization, the interactions, the impacts their transgressions have, that is still the big science agenda that is going on, and we need environmental modelers to, and also social scientists, basically, economists, mathematicians, to develop good concepts to calculate all this in a much more solid way than presently. Yeah, and if we want to stay as humanity within the safe space, this requires not only integrated assessments, how it could be done, but it needs, in the real world, really radical co-transformations to save planet Earth from being more and more degraded. So with that, I would like to thank you for your attention.
Yeah, thank you much, Dieter, for this illustrative talk. You go already into the societal aspects a lot, of course. It is
a bit.
Yeah,
a lot.
Yeah. So there's certainly a question. Michael will start.
So thank you very much for an excellent presentation of this important topic. It is clear that, in an era of capitalism run amok, we need some common reflection, rational reflection. But having grown up behind the Iron Curtain, there's also a certain flavor to this, which I dislike strongly. The safest operating space is a playpen, Gehschule. Okay?
What's that?
You don't know what a playpen? Where a baby, Gehschule in German? And we all have to get out of that, okay, in order to become adults. So, there is a certain preaching tone about this, which I find deeply disturbing. And, some proponents of this also use some of the language that I heard in growing up. We have to tighten our belt for the brilliant future. In French, le lendemain qui chante, which was the thing of the Communist Party of France, which was one of the most subservient communist parties in the West, So I'm sorry, I'm very conflicted about this. Please understand me. I don't think that we should not do some of these things, because obviously we need to. But maybe we should somehow find a way to talk about this, which is less, condescending, herablassend. Okay? So, maybe something for the panel that we're going to have later.
Yeah, that's, I think, a good idea, because it's more comment. Further questions? Otherwise, I would also have a question, because you touched upon already we have to regionalize. And on the other hand, you mentioned that the Holocene was a safe operating space. Well, I'm not sure about this. I mean, if we look around, at the last 10,000 years, there have been massive climate changes. Which affected locally the people, like the 8,200-year event, a massive cooling, and which would happen if it would happen today, would have dramatic consequences. No? Or the 4,200 or 400 event, which is reflected in Indian and Mediterranean stuff. So it might be interesting to see to which extent the Holocene was not safe. It was safe in the retrospect. We're still alive. Okay. But I think the same will be true if the borders will be crossed. Some of us will still be alive. So to close it in a bit more, to learn from history. Yeah. Are there any efforts to look into history to see if we apply this as a scheme, what does it imply?
That's another question that I'm personally actually very much interested in. Okay. So the assumption is the Holocene was quasi-stable. Yeah, maybe it was compared to future situations that might be ahead, but we need to understand the variability within the Holocene and really test these assumptions and what would have been done to a human civilization of like 7 billion 7.5 billion people if the little ice age would have happened now or things like this. So yeah, we need, and that's true for the climate, but also the biosphere has seen strong changes throughout the Holocene. And so it was not, that's not that one Holocene state, but big fluctuations. And I just came back also from a workshop that looked at the post-Columbian North and South America and how the people from Europe coming in there changed the system there and maybe leading to a CO2 drop in the end. So there were big changes through humanity already going on. That needs to be explored along the 9 dimensions, basically much deeper. You're totally right.
Okay, further questions?
If I may follow that.
And who's next?
Just go ahead after me, Benjamin.
Yourself?
So you're an expert in hydrology. So and the example of Holocene, I will just write in a paper where I say that Holocene is characterized by hydroclimate instability. So there were many mega droughts reflected in the paleo records, and some of them really lead to collapses of societies. So in this aspect, Holocene, of course, if you look just at the temperature curve, it's mostly flat. That's true, ice sheets are flat, but hydrology is not. So there were many punctuated events which just led to collapses of societies because it was not enough moisture, like the Angkor demise. So it's another
important aspect, like especially in the western USA, right? The mega droughts, they are now much wetter than historically, like 1,000 years ago. So that's
if
part
you
of this same discussion.
Yeah, if you zoom into the Holocene, it's not that stable.
We have nice Holocene runs. You could explore them.
Thank you very much. So, regarding the last part of the talk for food production, which I think is, well, it's not just interesting, but very important. And basically, the way you tackled it is from really a global perspective. So it's like, let's rearrange the food production so that it's best for the planet. But what would happen if you would not do that, and you would still have to, you would still apply the management systems for the water use efficiency and the soil, but leaving the production where it is now, as if saying, okay, the countries are still countries. We're not just one planet, and they're going to do their individual things. But have you looked into that and how it might affect the production?
So first of all, that is a global analysis, but really at this grid cell scale. So we have the spatial patterns behind this all the time. But we did not, and that's important that you're raising it, look into if we would just go on business as usual, which could be done, for example, with integrated assessment models and looking what they simulate, what would be the implications for the planetary boundaries in the state of the Earth system then. Because it would mean taking out even more water out of the system, polluting even more freshwater systems in the oceans with nitrogen and phosphorus, deforesting even more with adding to the climate change impacts which might come on top. So this sort of integration of the planetary framework, boundaries framework, with integrated assessments of business as usual or more sustainable future pathways. This has not been done yet, but it's really the next important step. So look into not the best worlds that I portrayed, what would happen in the less best world or the business as usual worlds to boundary status. But then comes the big question, what happens when these boundaries are transgressed and are they defined properly right now?
Okay, I think, the last question, because I have a number of more questions, but it's, you will be here, no? The coffee break, and then, I will ask you this question then. Okay, last question.
So I could have waited to the coffee break maybe.
Lunch.
Lunch
I'll
break.
be here until like 3 maybe.
It's a short one. Yeah, it's short. Yeah. So thank you for your talk. First of all, it was very nice. Having looked at this a little bit myself, or dived into the planetary boundaries framework, I mean, I am specifically, like, I'm an economist, so I tend to look at, like, what are the economic activities or the economic forces driving these planetary boundaries. And when it comes to climate change, I mean, there's been a lot of assessment on not only like country level emissions, but also, you know, like which specific sectors are contributing to emissions. But then another crucial boundary that I've been understood as kind of a core one, which is biodiversity. And in particular for that kind of control variable, which they put up there, is like the extinction rate per million species years. Are you aware of any kind of studies that have tried to kind of aggregate that based on kind of like what economic activities are driving that specific control variable, like extinction rate per species years on a global level? I haven't been able to do so, but I'm not a nervous system scientist. I thought you might have some insights. Thank you.
Not so really, maybe, because that's strongly related to the land use change you would see, but what produces this land use change and how it could be done differently could be further explored from this perspective. Not so sure.
Good.
About this.
Next point will be the discussion. Okay, then I would like, I think we should proceed. Thank you much, Dieter.